When I last had the opportunity to write a short essay about the Borderlands series, I wanted to develop a more well-rounded approach to understanding how the series approaches women. That video should still be available on this channel, but one thing I wrestled with in making it is the internal conflict I feel towards the visual language and depictions of female characters in video games. Even the language around these issues is poisoned. For example, many decry what they call the sexualization of female characters, but fail to distinguish between what they hold in their eye, what they are shown in the camera lens, and what is contained within the woman's body. We call all these things by the same name, her appearance. But to whom she appears, and how, was the central conflict of that essay, linked in the description. Before fully finishing my full-series philosophical retrospective on the Borderlands games, I wanted to broach the subject of the portrayal of women in this series once more, as it felt crucial to the larger arc and ideas of Borderlands. But first, before bringing to the forefront which Borderlands character we'll be considering in brief, it feels to me as if I have an important distinction to make. While my previous essay dealt with themes of disenfranchisement around cinematic norms and gendered themes, this essay takes that further but retreats into the eye and the mind. I want to pursue this idea of gay, female, lesbian, and transgender context to women's imaginations and self-knowledge. In a future essay, I already have a discussion planned for a piece by Ursula Le Guin titled War Without End, from her collection of essays The Wave in the Mind. A small piece of that essay goes like this. Having come to fear even the imagination of true change, many adults refuse all imaginative literature, priding themselves on seeing nothing beyond what they already know, or think they know. Yet, as if it feared its own troubling powers, much science fiction and fantasy is timid and reactionary in its social invention, fantasy clinging to feudalism, science fiction to military and imperial hierarchy. Both usually reward their hero, whether a man or a woman, only for doing outstandingly manly deeds. I wrote this way for years myself. In The Left Hand of Darkness, my hero is genderless, but his heroics are almost exclusively manly. In science fiction particularly, one also often meets the idea I discussed above, that anyone of inferior status, if not a rebel constantly ready to seize freedom through daring and violent action, is either despicable or simply of no consequence. In a world so morally simplified, if a slave is not Spartacus, he is nobody. This is merciless and unrealistic. We'll explore that essay more another day, but for now I'd prefer to zero in on this idea of masculine norms of heroism. It's clear that Le Guin saw an implicit limitation in the narrow avenue of conventionally masculine methods of resolving narrative conflict. I think her rebellion against these conventions comes across beautifully, for example, in some of the later Earthsea books. Tehanu and the Other Wind stand out to me in particular. What might stand out to some of you, however, is that this sentiment sounds like the opposite of another more well-known Le Guin quote, originating from 2 talks she gave and revised in her essay What Women Know, for print publication in her book, Words Are My Matter. Le Guin says, "But I didn't and still don't like making a cult of women's knowledge, preening ourselves on knowing things men don't know, women's deep irrational wisdom, women's instinctive knowledge of nature, and so on. All that all too often merely reinforces the masculinist idea of women as primitive and inferior, women's knowledge as elementary, primitive, always down below at the dark roots, while men get to cultivate and own the flowers and crops that come up into the light. But why should women keep talking baby talk while men get to grow up? Why should women feel blindly while men get to think?" Le Guin proclaims, like a character from her books, that she has lived long enough in the dark. If it is incumbent upon women to take their place in the light, what can we say of the violence of fire? Does a woman become a man by waging a war on sexism? Certainly that is a problematic implication, and to her credit, I don't think it's Le Guin's actual point of view. It is a necessary impulse in order to resolve the apparent contradiction between these points of view, to consider feminine violence, a human violence. We need to better understand what Le Guin was trying to say, and after some thought I believe I've gotten a hold of the thread, or my thread at least. Back to Borderlands. Of all the Borderlands games and all their characters, a few have remained consistent objects of affection in the fandom surrounding the franchise. Among these is Lilith, the Firehawk. Lilith was introduced in the first game, Borderlands, as a playable character, but was a returning non-player character in games up through Borderlands 3, including fan-favorite Borderlands 2 and the underrated Borderlands the pre-sequel. The existence of Lilith alongside the other player characters from Borderlands, and many of the memorable side characters, makes a strong case that Borderlands was, and has always been, one of the most inclusive franchises from its very inception. Diversity is clearly a tool the developers knew how to use extremely well, and in my opinion, that context contributes to some of the best elements of Lilith's character. In her book Ain't No Place for a Hero, Caitlin Tremblay offers a chapter meditating on the Sirens and the place of women in Borderlands, saying, "And this is why the Sirens in the Borderlands world are important. Their characterization allows them to be people and not just tropes. Sirens are more than just human. They're a little bit stronger, a little bit more powerful, and have very distinct tattoos running down one half of their body. Oh, and they're definitely only women." The comic series Borderlands Origins discusses Lilith's search for other sirens and her loneliness in explicit, heartbreaking detail. Lilith is originally from Dionysus, a planet named after the Greek god of wine and madness. Lilith's arc isn't the pursuit of love, it isn't to reconcile some past trauma. She is searching for her sisters, the only other women in the world who can possibly understand her and explain just what the hell it means to be a siren. That search for a sisterhood is one that defines many women's lives, especially in the male-dominated fields. That's a real story, a nuanced arc that is relatable and doesn't reduce Lilith to a character whose existence and reason for existing is predicated on male feelings. One point here is worthy of some further elaboration before we zoom out to the big picture. Not all sirens are women. Technically, there is a male siren, Troy, twin brother of Tyreen. Tyreen is the actual siren, the woman who was born to be a siren. Troy has siren powers by virtue of being her twin, and chiefly steals siren power from other sirens, with Tyreen lending him some of her powers initially before he kills Maya and steals her powers. I have some criticism of the quest structure of Borderlands 3 that will be worth elaborating on in my larger essay, but to begin with, I think the character of Troy and what he represents is important here specifically because of what he is and what he isn't. He is a siren, and he isn't a woman. He gets his powers from women. This is a funny inversion of the earlier discussed tendency for women's power to be seen as either a subalternate inferior of male power, or an attempt to claim male power and thus lose one's femininity. The sirens of Borderlands have a definite quality of feminine power. What's important for us here is not merely that this is the case, but that it specifically exists in the context of violence. Perhaps Le Guin would approve, and perhaps she wouldn't, we may never know. But more provocatively, Lilith's character arc culminates in Borderlands 3 in a heroic sacrifice. Ava told her earlier in the game that what Maya taught her before she died was that a hero is someone who runs towards the fire. Lilith repeats those words back to her and takes off to stop the moon Elpis from destroying Pandora, the planet that had become her home for so long, the planet where her lover was buried, the planet she once came to seeking answers, seeking sisterhood. She dies to protect that sisterhood, and the audience is left wondering what it means. Borderlands 3 has a narrative that I feel is often undervalued, specifically for the reason that so few people seem interested, at least among video essayists, in unpacking the particulars of its desire to tell a story about women and the power of women, especially as this relates to being a sister or a daughter. In a very telling move, the writers chose to make mothers absent from the narrative. Maya is the closest thing Ava has to a mother, more of a big sister, and Ava loses her. Tyreen and Troy lost their mother young and were raised by their father, Typhon de Leon. As a man, Typhon de Leon clearly loves his daughter Tyreen, who he confronts well after Troy is dead. But his dying words are to the player and the Crimson Raiders: "Don't be the last Vault Hunters." The kinship felt there isn't one of blood, but one of creed. A Vault Hunter is something you are because it's something you choose to be. Whose blood you are is less important, or so Borderlands 3 would appear to posit. The thing I admire about Lilith, the thing that gives me comfort for reasons that will become clear momentarily, is that she is who she is through necessity. Maybe it isn't philosophically interesting to write a female character to have her arc conclude in martyrdom, but it is a death, and it has meaning, and that's as good of an ending as anything. Every character in Borderlands 3, living or dead, comes to resemble something about Lilith and her journey. This is clearly her game. Maya represents the revelation of found family and the loss sometimes incurred through that revelation. Troy and Tyreen are the opposite. both the absence of and the presence of given family, and the pain contained therein. Lilith is stuck in her own contradiction, of seeking something and being unable to have it. She isn't a mother because she has no children, she isn't a daughter because she doesn't know her parents, and she isn't a wife because she belongs to no one. She is so like us. In fact, all the DLCs from Borderlands 3 also have special points of synchronicity with Lilith's character. She is a dark mirror in the antagonist of the Bounty of Blood DLC, where we see just where Lilith's search for camaraderie could end if she didn't value the people around her. In the Guns, Love, and Tentacles DLC, we see the kind of partnership Lilith was fated never to have due to the loss of Roland. In the Moxie's Heist of the Handsome Jackpot DLC, we see how a self-sacrifice like Lilith's could end differently if someone else had been there to shoulder her burden with her, the way that Moxie is there for Timothy. In the Psycho Krieg and the Fantastic Fustercluck DLC, we can see how Maya is mourned by someone who truly loved her, a loss that mirrors Lilith's loss of Roland, as we're reminded of the people our characters have also left behind. That last one hits a lot of people particularly hard, but I think the real reason the DLCs are considered the swan song of Borderlands 3 by so many runs deeper than them just being well written and well designed, which of course they very much are. I feel the same way about the majority of the base game as well, but those 4 DLCs contextualize the ideas that Borderlands 3 is trying to convey in ways I think it's easier to relate to piecemeal, so it's a bit more of a challenge to step back and really see how they all fit together. It's a great game in a lot of ways, in my opinion, and I think connecting with Lilith on a personal level was a part of what helped me to see that. I'd played as Lilith before, but never really saw myself in her on that kind of emotional level beyond relating to her awkwardness or insecurity as conveyed in the earlier games. Lilith is great, one of the truly titanic characters of video games as a medium. I don't think I thought that way about her when I first beat Borderlands 3, but upon replaying the game in full to max out a character in the process of getting footage for the retrospective over the past year and a half, I get it now. I understand her, I think. So much of who Lilith is comes from circumstance, but specifically her power is a desire and a need. It represents her desire to connect with others, but more than that, her need to help others and to help herself. She's a surprisingly altruistic person, for a landscape as bleak as Pandora, all her joking aside, and that altruism is really what makes Lilith into Lilith. She's here to help, and while this often presents through violence and aggression, in her context, these only reinforce the thing about her that is so particularly feminine, that being her siren powers. I think there's something special about that. The necessity of characters like Lilith is something that I think can be felt by many people who play these games. At the end of the aforementioned chapter, Tremblay writes, "In an industry where women standing up against inequality or harassment is met with more harassment, death and rape threats, and the potential loss of their jobs, women characters integral to the game and the game's mythos, to refuse to shut up, refuse to be pawns, refuse to be sidelined, are something remarkable and worth celebrating. The more things change, the more they stay the same, or so I've heard. But one thing that has not changed about the world, which is to say that I cannot see it in the same light, is that despite how women are so often spoken of in terms of what men have that they lack, nevertheless the persistent pursuit of women, of their knowledge and presence and power, reveals an obsession with something that is overly present. A woman occupies space. She is definitionally a creature of presence, and this is the case for Le Guin, well beyond the manner in which the lack of light is also the presence of darkness. I would suggest that what is actually happening in this cultural discussion where women's stories are understood in terms relative to men's stories is that we have a sense across womanhood that it is something gatekept or colonized or perhaps, most precisely, decentered. Man is made the sun of woman's life. He is the entity to which she is subordinated, the ideal towards which she is uplifted, and the source of her energy is the creature she is told she is. To be something else, she has to be her own source with her own drive, which is another way of saying the character of womanhood is challenged by her emancipation. From an intellectual standpoint, it is challenging to imagine the idea of womanhood as a stationary nature when we are also imagining it changing. What this paradox mostly reminds me of, however, is political struggle. The woman's struggle to know herself on her own terms is a struggle to fight for herself. She needs her own epistemic viewpoint, because she inhabits a life that is first and foremost shown to her through her own eyes as something which is not her own, or does not exist on her own terms, It would seem men even occupy the terrain of her vision. Her world is not her world. A succinct explanation of this phenomenon was once given in the context of Black Struggle by W.E.B. Du Bois, republished in The Souls of Black Folk, where he says, "After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with the veil, and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So it is with white people and black people, and so it is with men and women. Women do not control women's bodies, men do that. It is a fitting parallel. You can hear in this passage a fitting deployment of the term double consciousness, for which many credit Du Bois. In this context, the credit is fair. However, a prior use of this term is also quite famous, and comes from a piece by Ralph Waldo Emerson, titled The Transcendentalist, where he says, "Much of our reading, much of our labor, seems mere waiting. It was not that we were born for. Any other could do it as well or better. So little skill enters into these works, so little do they mix with the divine life, that it really signifies little what we do, whether we turn a grindstone or ride or run, or make fortunes or govern the state. The worst feature of this double consciousness is that the two lives, of the understanding and of the soul, which we lead, really show very little relation to each other, never meet and measure each other. One prevails now, all buzz and din, and the other prevails then, all infinitude and paradise. And, with the progress of life, the two discover no greater disposition to reconcile themselves." Now we return to the question of action that I put to you all earlier in this essay. Is the woman's action available to her in its full measure? Is she violent, or does this make her no longer a woman? Must she change and therefore refuse her own self, her selfhood? A woman, it would seem to me, is a great becoming. A woman is change. To wrestle with oneself is to survive one's past, truly survive it, not merely to continue to live, but to be a survivor, one who goes on. This is why being transgender is another way of living in the light of the truth. It is a reconciliation with the world, an I am above the clamor of a you are. Where existential questions are concerned, prescriptions are secondary. In other words, in this way it is actually what women already know, or come to know, which is paramount. No one can tell a woman who she is, so long as she is a woman, because she is the one who knows herself. But to be transgender can often feel like being an intruder in a space not made for you, not the least because this is the insistence of people who believe it is their right, and I know it is their privilege, to command and control such spaces and to dictate who deserves what. This is another example of the colonized consciousness. The terrain of the mind is occupied by an invading force and must be reclaimed. So often, transgender people, gay people, women, and others must have not just the clarity of purpose that comes from an ability or desire to know themselves, but also strength to carve out their existence. This strength does not come from nowhere. Strength comes too easily from anger, and so anger is the quickest way to defend oneself. I have found my anger, and the anger of women, a useful tool. I honor it. But is this a concession? I do not have any easy answers. I know I need to be strong, but I do sometimes wish to be gentle. I would have liked to have been born differently, maybe, if only a little, as much as I wish the world could also be different than it is. Could I have been my mother, beautiful and kind? I do not know and will not pretend to know. I wish, but suspect not. I have too much anger when I see how the world works, and I am in that world. The running towards the fire, that's the difficult part. Le Guin said once, "Hard times are coming," and that we'll need writers who can remember freedom. The artists of the world must now understand that in this age, their bravery is what's required. You have to be brave to prefer inconvenient truths over convenient lies. Among the most convenient lies of our society rests at the heart of what we call the transgender debate. But underneath so much anti-trans antagonism is the fatigue that comes from loss of power, the feeling of loss that if one loses the ability to dictate womanhood, then womanhood will be a thing uncontrolled, unmoored, and maybe then ultimately lost. The trouble with this feeling is that it is less created by transgender people than the other way around. We are the consequence of gender, the logical outcome. The attempt to occupy the territory of our consciousness falls flat when we realize it is only a fear conjured by its own belief system, a thing jumping at its own shadow. I have in so many ways feared my own power. I hesitated to use my voice for fear of its sound. I hesitated to see my face for fear of its look. I hesitated to take up space for fear of the shape of my body. I hesitated to look other human beings in the eyes for fear of what they would see. I do not want to be afraid of what I love about myself. I do not want to resist the impulse to live. And to have the presence of mind to assert one's own unapologetic life, I think, is how we begin to take our power back. My mother made me. How could I curse the gift of my anger or strength of my hands? I do not curse her power. It is clearly one thing to have power and another thing to be loved. I would argue Lilith is on the quest for love by other means. She is looking for her sisters, or for a sisterhood. And this is the inciting incident of her arrival on Pandora. What or who she finds, Maya, Amara, Tanis, and Ava in the good times, Tyreen and Troy in the bad times, is not what I find so vexing about her character. Lilith sacrifices herself to protect that sisterhood. She fights to defend its existence, just as she fought to acquire it. She is, in some ways, the ultimate mother, the ultimate sister, the ultimate woman. She is a woman who knows who she is and what she has to do. Woman is a fire, and I see the light.